My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm 28 years old. I live in a small apartment in Portland, Oregon, where the rain seems to wash away everything except the memories I wish I could forget. 3 months ago, my grandfather passed away, leaving behind more questions than answers. Grandpa Liu was always the mysterious one in our family. While other kids had grandfathers who told bedtime stories about fairy tales, mine would whisper about the old days and people who weren't what they seemed. My parents always brushed off his stories as the ramblings of an elderly man, but I listened. I always listened. I work as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm downtown, a job that pays the bills but doesn't exactly fulfill my dreams. Most days, I take the Max light rail to work, watching the city wake up through rain-streaked windows. Portland has this way of making everything look soft and melancholy, like the whole world is perpetually on the verge of tears. My apartment is on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian house in the Hawthorne district. It's small but cozy, with exposed brick walls and hardwood floors that creak when I walk around at night. I share the building with 5 other tenants, including Jake, who moved in about a year ago and quickly became the kind of neighbor who remembers to water your plants when you're out of town. The relationship with my parents has always been complicated. They immigrated from Taiwan when I was 3, and they've spent my entire life trying to assimilate, to become as American as possible. They speak English at home, celebrate Thanksgiving with more enthusiasm than Chinese New Year, and seem determined to forget where they came from. But Grandpa Liu never forgot. He lived in a small house in southeast Portland, surrounded by his books and memories. The house smelled like jasmine tea and mothballs, and every surface was covered with photographs of people and places I didn't recognize. When I was little, I would spend hours there, listening to his stories about Taiwan, about the family we'd left behind, about the reasons they'd come to America. "Sarah," he would say, his English still heavily accented after 40 years in the country, "you must remember that sometimes the stories people tell about themselves are not the whole truth. Sometimes people have very good reasons for keeping secrets." My parents would get frustrated when they picked me up from these visits. "He's filling your head with nonsense," my mother would say. "The past is the past. We need to focus on the future." But I couldn't let go of Grandpa's stories. There was something in his eyes when he told them, a weight, a sadness that suggested they were more than just the nostalgic ramblings of an old man. He spoke about people who had followed them to America, about documents that needed to be protected, about friends who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The night he died, I was at home watching Netflix and eating leftover Chinese takeout. It was a Tuesday in July, unremarkably warm for Portland, and I had no idea that my world was about to change forever. The call came at 11:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was looking at my phone, debating whether to watch another episode or go to bed. It was Mrs. Patterson, Grandpa's next-door neighbor. Her voice was shaky, filled with the kind of shock that comes with unexpected death. "Sarah, honey, I'm so sorry. I found your grandfather this morning. He passed away in his sleep. The paramedics said it was his heart." The funeral was small and quiet, held at a funeral home in southeast Portland that specialized in serving the Asian community. My parents handled all the arrangements with their typical efficiency, but I could see the strain in their faces. Losing Grandpa meant losing the last connection to their old life, to the stories and memories they'd been trying so hard to forget. I gave the eulogy, speaking about Grandpa's love of books, his careful tending of his small garden, his patience in teaching me to write Chinese characters when I was young. But I didn't mention the stories about surveillance and secrets. Those seemed too personal, too fragile to share with the small gathering of neighbors and distant relatives. After the service, Mrs. Patterson approached me with tears in her eyes. She was a petite woman in her 70s, with carefully styled gray hair and the kind of floral dress that suggested she'd grown up in a different era. "Your grandfather was such a good man," she said, taking my hands in hers. "He used to worry so much about you, you know. He always said you were the one who understood him best. Did he ever talk to you about his past? About Taiwan?" Something flickered in her eyes, so quickly I almost missed it. "Oh, you know how old people are, dear. Always living in the past. He mentioned the old country sometimes, but nothing specific. Why do you ask?" "Just curious. He used to tell me stories when I was little. Well, I'm sure they were lovely stories. He had such an imagination. The way she said imagination bothered me, but I couldn't put my finger on why. It felt dismissive, like she was trying to minimize the importance of whatever Grandpa might have told me. 3 days after the funeral, I was back at work, trying to focus on a logo design for a local coffee shop. The normalcy felt surreal. How could I be choosing fonts and adjusting color palettes when my grandfather had just died? But grief, I was learning, doesn't pause for practical considerations. That's when Mr. Davidson called. Mr. Davidson was Grandpa's attorney, a man I'd met only briefly at the funeral. His voice on the phone was professional, but carried an undertone of urgency that made my stomach twist. "Sarah, your grandfather left specific instructions about a particular item in his estate. He wanted you to have it immediately before the rest of the inheritance is processed. Could you come to his house this afternoon?" I left work early, telling my boss I had family business to handle. The drive to Grandpa's house took me through neighborhoods I'd known since childhood, past the elementary school where I'd learned English, past the park where Grandpa had taught me to play xiangqi, past the Vietnamese restaurant where we'd eaten pho every Sunday after I'd turned 16 and discovered a love for spicy food. The house looked smaller somehow, as if grief had shrunk it along with everything else. The garden that Grandpa had tended so carefully was already showing signs of neglect, weeds creeping up between the vegetables, flowers drooping from lack of water. It broke my heart to think that all his careful work would simply disappear now that he was gone. Mr. Davidson met me at the front door. He was a tall, thin man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, probably in his early 60s. His gray suit was immaculate despite the humid Portland summer, and he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd spent decades helping families navigate their most difficult moments. "Before we go in," he said, adjusting his glasses in a gesture that seemed nervous, "I need to tell you something. Your grandfather came to see me 2 weeks before he died. He was agitated, more concerned than I'd ever seen him. He insisted that this box be given to you, and only you, under very specific circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" "He said to wait until after his death, and to make sure you were alone when you opened it. He was very insistent about that last part. He also said..." Mr. Davidson paused, looking uncomfortable. "He said that if anything happened to him unexpectedly, I should make sure the police knew about our conversation." A chill ran down my spine. "Did you think something was going to happen to him?" I thought he was a worried old man, concerned about his family's safety. But now, given how specific his instructions were, he trailed off, shaking his head. "I'm probably overthinking things. Grief makes us all a little paranoid." We walked through the house together, and I was struck by how quiet it was. Grandpa's house had always been full of small sounds: the tick of his antique clock, the hum of his ancient refrigerator, the rustle of pages as he turned through his books. Now it felt hollow, like a shell waiting to be filled with new life. His study was exactly as I remembered it: towers of books in both English and Mandarin, creating a maze of knowledge that had always seemed magical to me as a child. The walls were covered with maps of Taiwan and mainland China, marked with pins and notes in Grandpa's careful handwriting. His desk was still cluttered with papers, half-finished crossword puzzles, and the magnifying glass he'd needed for reading in recent years. But today, the desk held something new. A wooden box sat in the center, about the size of a shoebox, with intricate carvings that seemed to tell a story I couldn't quite decipher. The wood was dark with age, and the carvings depicted scenes of people traveling, families being separated, and what looked like documents being hidden or exchanged. It was the label that made my blood run cold. In Grandpa's careful handwriting, both in English and Chinese characters, it read, "Don't trust them, for Sarah's eyes only." "He wrote that the day before he died," Mr. Davidson said quietly. I asked him what it meant, but he just shook his head and said, "You'd understand when the time came." He seemed frightened, Sarah. In all the years I'd known him, I'd never seen him scared of anything. I stared at the box, my hands trembling. The weight of Grandpa's stories suddenly felt very real, very urgent. All those times he'd told me about people who weren't what they seemed, about the importance of keeping family secrets safe. Had he been preparing me for this moment? "I'll leave you alone," Mr. Davidson said, heading toward the door. "Take all the time you need. Lock the door behind me if you want. Your grandfather was very clear that this should be a private moment." I did exactly that. The click of the lock echoed in the quiet room, and suddenly I felt very alone with whatever secrets my grandfather had been keeping. The box seemed to pulse with hidden knowledge, and the afternoon light streaming through the windows cast long shadows that made everything feel ominous and significant. I approached the desk slowly, as if the box might explode if I moved too quickly. Up close, I could see more details in the carvings, faces that looked familiar, buildings that might have been from Taiwan, and symbols that I recognized from some of Grandpa's books. The craftsmanship was exquisite, suggesting that this wasn't just a storage container, but something important, something that had been made to last. My hands were shaking as I reached for the box. The wood was warm, as if it had been sitting in sunlight, though the study was dimly lit. As I lifted it, I could feel that it was heavier than it looked, dense with whatever secrets lay inside. The lid opened smoothly, revealing an interior lined with red silk that had faded with age. The first thing I saw was a letter addressed to me in Grandpa's handwriting. My name was written in both English and Chinese characters, the way he used to write it on birthday cards when I was little. Beneath the letter were photographs, dozens of them, some in color, but most in black and white. There were documents with official seals, what looked like financial records, and a small, worn journal bound in leather. At the very bottom of the box was a key, attached to a piece of cardboard with an address written in Grandpa's careful script. I picked up the letter first, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in the quiet room. The paper was thick and expensive, the kind Grandpa used for important correspondence. It was dated just 1 week before his death. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then the time has come for you to know the truth about our family. I have carried this burden for 60 years, and I cannot take it to my grave. What I am about to tell you will change everything you believe about who we are and why we came to America. The story your parents tell about our immigration, that we came seeking better opportunities in the 1960s, is only partially true. We came because we were running, not from poverty, but from people who wanted to silence us forever. Your great-grandfather, my father, was not just a teacher as you have been told. He was a journalist in Taiwan, working for a small independent newspaper that dared to investigate corruption in the government. In 1962, he discovered evidence of massive theft, money that was supposed to help rebuild Taiwan after the war was being diverted into private accounts, funding the luxurious lifestyles of politicians and businessmen while ordinary people struggled to survive. When he tried to publish his findings, he was warned to stop. Phone calls in the middle of the night, threatening letters, men watching our house. But your great-grandfather was a stubborn man, convinced that the truth was more important than his personal safety. He continued his investigation, gathering more evidence, building a case that would have brought down some of the most powerful people in Taiwan. That's when they decided he had to be eliminated. The night they came for him, we were ready. A friend had warned us that the police, or men pretending to be police, were planning to arrest him on false charges. We knew that once he was in custody, he would never be seen again, so we ran. But we didn't leave empty-handed. Your great-grandfather had documented everything, and he brought those documents with him to America. He hid them, thinking someday they might be needed again, that someone might continue the work he'd started. He died in 1968, before he could tell me exactly where he'd put them. But I've spent 40 years searching, and I finally found them. Sarah, there are people who still want these documents. The corruption your great-grandfather discovered wasn't limited to Taiwan. It was part of an international network that extends to the United States, Canada, and other countries. Some of the people involved in the original crimes moved to America and built new lives here, but they never forgot about the evidence that could destroy them. They've been watching our family for decades, waiting. Some of them have gained our trust, become our friends, our neighbors, but they are not what they seem. They have been patient, careful, professional, but they are still dangerous, and they are still looking for the documents that could ruin them. The photographs and papers in this box will prove everything I'm telling you, but you must be careful. The moment you start investigating, they will know. Trust no one except yourself until you can verify who is truly on your side. There is one person who can help you, a man named David Chen in San Francisco. He is the nephew of my old friend Chen Li Ming, who helped us escape Taiwan. David knows the whole story, and he has been waiting for someone from our family to contact him. His information is in the box. Sarah, I am sorry to burden you with this knowledge, but I could not let the truth die with me. You are the only one in our family who ever listened to my stories, who understood that they were more than just the ramblings of an old man. You are the only one I trust to decide what to do with this information. Be careful, my dear granddaughter. The people who killed your great-grandfather are still out there, and they will not hesitate to protect their secrets. Your loving grandfather, Liu Wei-ming. I read the letter 3 times, each reading making the reality more terrifying and more real. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the pages, and I felt like the room was spinning around me. Everything I thought I knew about my family's history was a lie. We weren't just immigrants seeking a better life. We were refugees, running from people who had killed my great-grandfather and would kill again to protect their secrets. I set the letter down and picked up the first photograph. It was black and white, showing a young man who looked remarkably like my grandfather, standing next to what appeared to be a printing press. He was wearing a white shirt and dark pants, and his expression was serious, determined. On the back of the photo, someone had written, Taipei, 1963, last story. The next photograph showed the same man, but this time he was with a woman and 2 small children. They were standing in front of a building with Chinese characters above the door, and they all looked scared. Someone had written, Last Day in Taiwan, February 15, 1963, on the back. Then I found the documents. They were in Chinese, and while my ability to read the language was limited, I could see they were official papers, government documents with impressive seals, financial records with long columns of numbers, and what appeared to be correspondence between high-ranking officials. Even without being able to read every word, I could sense the importance of what I was looking at. But it was the journal that made my heart stop. I drove through the familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood, past the coffee shops and bookstores that defined Portland's character. The rain drummed against my windshield, creating a rhythm that matched my anxious heartbeat. Grandpa's house looked smaller somehow, as if grief had shrunk it along with everything else. Mr. Davidson met me at the front door, his gray suit immaculate despite the weather. He was a tall, thin man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. We'd met briefly at the funeral, but today he seemed different, more cautious, almost nervous. Before we go in, he said, adjusting his glasses, I need to tell you something. Your grandfather came to see me 2 weeks before he died. He was agitated. He insisted that this box be given to you, and only you, under very specific circumstances. What kind of circumstances? He said to wait until after his death, and to make sure you were alone when you opened it. He was very insistent about that last part. The house smelled like jasmine tea and old books, exactly as I remembered. Mr. Davidson led me to Grandpa's study, where towers of books, in both English and Mandarin, created a maze of knowledge. On the mahogany desk sat a wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, with intricate carvings that seemed to tell a story I couldn't quite decipher. But it was the label that made my blood run cold. In Grandpa's careful handwriting, it read, Don't trust them, for Sarah's eyes only. He wrote that the day before he died, Mr. Davidson said quietly. I asked him what it meant, but he just shook his head and said you'd understand when the time came. My hands trembled as I reached for the box. The wood was warm, as if it had been sitting in sunlight, though the study was dimly lit. The carvings depicted scenes of people traveling, families separated, and what looked like documents being hidden. I'll leave you alone, Mr. Davidson said, heading toward the door. Take all the time you need. Lock the door behind me if you want. I did exactly that. The click of the lock echoed in the quiet room, and suddenly, I felt very alone. The box seemed to pulse with secrets, and my grandfather's warning echoed in my mind. Don't trust them. Who was them? I lifted the lid slowly, and the first thing I saw was a letter addressed to me in Grandpa's handwriting. My name was written in both English and Chinese characters, the way he used to write it on birthday cards. Beneath the letter were photographs, documents, and what looked like a small, worn journal. The letter was dated just 1 week before his death. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then the time has come for you to know the truth about our family. I have carried this burden for 60 years, and I cannot take it to my grave. What I am about to tell you will change everything you believe about who we are and why we came to America. The story your parents tell about our immigration, that we came seeking better opportunities in the 1960s, is only partially true. We came because we were running, not from poverty, but from people who wanted to silence us. Your great-grandfather, my father, was a journalist in Taiwan. He discovered evidence of corruption that went to the highest levels of government. When he tried to publish his findings, he was warned to stop. When he refused, they came for him. We barely escaped with our lives, but we didn't leave empty-handed. Your great-grandfather had documented everything, and he brought those documents with him to America. He hid them, thinking someday they might be needed again. He died before he could tell me where, but I've spent 40 years searching, and I finally found them. Sarah, there are people who still want these documents. They've been watching our family for decades, waiting. Some of them have gained our trust, become our friends, our neighbors, but they are not what they seem. The documents in this box will prove everything, but you must be careful. The moment you start investigating, they will know. Trust no one except yourself until you can verify who is truly on your side. Your loving grandfather, Liu Wei-ming. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the letter. I set it down and picked up the first photograph. It was black and white, showing a young man who looked remarkably like my grandfather, standing next to what appeared to be a printing press. The back of the photo was labeled Taipei, 1963. The next photograph showed the same man, but this time he was with a woman and two small children. They were standing in front of a building with Chinese characters. Someone had written, "Last Day in Taiwan," on the back. Then I found the documents. They were in Chinese, but even with my limited ability to read the language, I could see they were official papers, government documents, financial records, and what appeared to be correspondence between high-ranking officials. But it was the journal that made my heart stop. The first entry was dated December 15, 1963. They found us at the hotel. Chen says we have maybe 6 hours before they come. Ming Hui is packing the children's things. I've hidden the evidence in the false bottom of Wei Ming's toy box. If something happens to me, he will know where to look. I flipped through more pages, each one detailing their escape, their journey to America, and their constant fear of being discovered. The final entry was dated March 3, 1964. We have been in Portland for 3 months. The authorities here say we are safe, but I see the same faces in crowds. Chen was right. They followed us. We must be more careful than ever. My phone buzzed, startling me. It was a text from my mom. "Hope you're doing okay, honey. Mrs. Patterson from next door asked about you. She wanted to know if you'd found anything interesting in Grandpa's things." Mrs. Patterson, the sweet elderly woman who had been Grandpa's neighbor for 20 years. She always brought him soup when he was sick and helped him with his groceries. She was the one who found him the morning he died. But now, with my grandfather's warning fresh in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that her interest seemed unusual. Why would she care about what I found in his belongings? I took pictures of everything with my phone, then carefully put the documents back in the box. As I was closing it, I noticed something I'd missed before. A small key taped to the inside of the lid, and beneath it, another note. Storage Unit 247, East Side Self-Storage, 3rd and Morrison. The truth is bigger than you know. Find Chen. Chen, the name from the journal. Could he still be alive? I locked the box and slipped the key into my pocket. As I was leaving the study, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Patterson in her garden, but she wasn't gardening. She was on her phone, and she was looking directly at Grandpa's house. Our eyes met for just a moment through the glass, and she quickly looked away, ending her call. I left through the back door, my heart pounding. As I got into my car, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family's history was a lie. And if my grandfather was right, some of the people I'd trusted my entire life weren't who they claimed to be. The rain had stopped, but the clouds remained dark and threatening. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every car behind me seemed suspicious. Every face in my rearview mirror looked familiar yet threatening. But I had to know the truth. I had to find Chen and discover what my family had been hiding for 60 years, even if it meant discovering that the people I trusted most were my enemies. The box sat on my passenger seat, and I could almost hear my grandfather's voice. Don't trust them. Now I was beginning to understand what he meant. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of rain against my apartment windows. Portland in October was always gray and wet, but today, the weather seemed to match my mood. Uncertain and heavy with the promise of storms. I'd barely slept, spending most of the night researching everything I could about East Side self-storage and trying to find any trace of someone named Chen who might have known my grandfather. The internet had given me some leads, but nothing concrete. My coffee had gone cold as I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the photographs from Grandpa's box. In the daylight, I could see details I'd missed before. In one photo, there was a man standing slightly behind my great-grandfather. He was young, maybe in his 20s, with sharp eyes and a serious expression. On the back, someone had written, Chen Li-ming, 1963. Could this be the Chen my grandfather wanted me to find? I was interrupted by a knock at my door. My heart jumped. I wasn't expecting anyone. And after yesterday's revelations, every unexpected visitor felt like a threat. Through the peephole, I saw my neighbor, Jake Morrison. He was a freelance photographer who lived in the apartment next to mine. We'd been friendly for the past year, often sharing coffee and conversations about our respective work. He looked concerned. Sarah, I heard you moving around all night. Everything okay? I opened the door, keeping the chain lock engaged. Yeah, just couldn't sleep. You know how it is. Jake was tall and lean, with brown hair that always looked like he'd just run his fingers through it. He had kind eyes and a smile that usually made me feel better about whatever was bothering me. But today, remembering my grandfather's warning, I found myself studying his face differently. Listen, I know you've been dealing with your grandfather's passing, he said, his voice gentle. If you need someone to talk to, I'm here. Sometimes it helps to get things off your chest. There was something in his tone, a subtle urgency that seemed out of place for casual neighbor concern. Or maybe I was being paranoid. Thanks, Jake. I appreciate it. I'm actually heading out for a while. Need to take care of some things. Want some company? I don't have any shoots today. No, that's okay. Family stuff, you know? He nodded, but I caught something in his expression. Disappointment? Relief? I couldn't tell. After he left, I realized I needed to be more careful. If my grandfather was right about people watching our family, then anyone could be involved. Even Jake, who had moved in just a few months after Grandpa's stories about surveillance had intensified. I grabbed my jacket and the storage unit key, then headed out into the drizzle. East Side Self-Storage was a 20-minute drive from my apartment, located in an industrial area near the Willamette River. The facility was older, with long rows of orange metal units that looked like they'd been there since the 1980s. The office was small and cramped, with a heavy-set woman behind the counter who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Her name tag read, Dolores. I need to access Unit 247, I said, showing her the key. She looked at it with disinterest. Name? Sarah Chen. I'd decided to use my grandfather's surname, hoping it might be how the unit was registered. She typed something into her computer, then frowned. Says here the unit's been paid up for 20 years in advance. Haven't seen anyone come for it in, well, ever. You got ID? I showed her my driver's license. She compared it to something on her screen, then shrugged. Close enough. Unit 247 is in Building C, about halfway down on the right. You need a flashlight? Please. The walk to Building C felt longer than it should have. Each step echoed in the empty corridors, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows that made every corner look like it might be hiding someone. Unit 247 was identical to all the others, an orange metal door with a simple lock. My hands trembled as I inserted the key. It turned easily, as if it had been used recently. The door rolled up with a metallic screech that seemed to announce my presence to the world. Inside, the unit was about the size of a walk-in closet, with concrete walls and a musty smell that spoke of decades of storage. There were only a few items inside: a small filing cabinet, 2 cardboard boxes, and what looked like an old trunk. But it was the filing cabinet that drew my attention first. The top drawer was labeled Chen Li-ming in my grandfather's handwriting. Inside, I found dozens of files, each one meticulously organized. There were immigration documents, employment records, and what appeared to be surveillance reports. But it was the personal correspondence that made my heart race. The letters were in English, written in a careful hand. The first one was dated 1965. Dear Wei Ming, I hope this letter finds you and your family well. I have been thinking about our conversation regarding the documents. I believe it is time to consider making them public. The situation in Taiwan has not improved, and the people responsible for your father's death are still in power. I have made contact with a journalist here in San Francisco who might be willing to help us. His name is Robert Chen, no relation, and he has experience with international corruption cases. However, I must warn you, I have noticed unusual activity around my apartment. Phone calls that disconnect when I answer. The same car parked outside for hours at a time. They may have found me. If something happens to me, look for my nephew, David Chen. He works at the Chinese Cultural Center in San Francisco. Tell him about the documents, and he will know what to do. Stay safe, my friend. Chen Liming. The letter was dated just 3 weeks before my grandfather's journal entries about being followed. Chen had been right to be worried. I found more letters, each one detailing increased surveillance and Chen's growing fear. The final letter was dated December 1965. Wei Ming, this will be my last letter. They came to my apartment yesterday, but I was not home. My neighbor, Mrs. Wong, said they claimed to be from the immigration office, but she didn't believe them. Their English was too good, and they knew too much about my daily routine. I am leaving San Francisco tonight. I will go to my cousin in Vancouver, Canada. The documents you have are more important than ever. The journalist, Robert Chen, was found dead in his apartment last week. The police called it a suicide, but I know better. My nephew David will continue the work. Find him when it is safe to do so. I pray we will meet again in better times. Chen Liming. My hands were shaking as I set the letter down. This was real. My grandfather hadn't been paranoid or delusional. There really were people who had been hunting my family for decades. I opened the cardboard boxes and found more evidence, photographs of meetings, copies of financial records, and what appeared to be a list of names. Some of the names had been crossed out, with dates written next to them. Others were circled in red ink. One name made my blood run cold. Patterson Helen, Portland, Oregon. Active surveillance since 1985. Mrs. Patterson, my grandfather's sweet neighbor who had been watching him for 35 years. I photographed everything I could, then carefully packed the most important documents into my backpack. As I was closing the unit, I heard footsteps echoing in the corridor. I quickly pulled the door down and locked it, then tried to look casual as I walked toward the exit. But the footsteps were getting closer, and they seemed to be following my pace. I ducked into an alcove between two buildings and waited. Jake Morrison appeared at the end of the corridor, moving slowly and looking at the unit numbers. When he reached 247, he stopped and tried the handle. Finding it locked, he pulled out his phone and made a call. "She was here," he said quietly. "Unit's been accessed recently." No, I don't know what she took. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. Jake, my friendly neighbor who'd been so concerned about my well-being, was part of whatever conspiracy had been following my family. I waited until he left, then made my way back to my car. As I drove home, I realized that my grandfather's warning had been an understatement. It wasn't just that I couldn't trust them. I couldn't trust anyone. But I had a lead. David Chen in San Francisco. If he was still alive, he might be the only person who could help me understand what my family had been hiding and why people were still willing to kill for it. The rain had started again, heavier now, and the windshield wipers couldn't keep up with the downpour. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I noticed Mrs. Patterson standing at her window, watching. When she saw me looking, she quickly closed the curtains. I sat in my car for a long moment, trying to process everything I'd learned. My grandfather's neighbor was a spy. My friendly neighbor was working for whoever had been hunting my family. And somewhere in San Francisco, there might be one person who could help me understand why. The box of documents seemed to pulse with danger on my passenger seat. I realized that opening it had started something I couldn't stop, but I also knew I couldn't go back to pretending everything was normal. I had to find David Chen, even if it meant walking into a trap. The flight to San Francisco was the longest 2 hours of my life. I'd booked it under a false name, something I'd learned from reading my grandfather's documents about maintaining secrecy. It felt surreal, like I was living in a spy novel rather than my own life. I'd left Portland at dawn, slipping out of my apartment building through the basement parking garage to avoid Mrs. Patterson's watchful eyes. Jake's apartment had been dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from somewhere. The Chinese Cultural Center was located in the heart of San Francisco's Chinatown, a 3-story building with traditional architecture that seemed to bridge the gap between old and new worlds. The morning fog was just beginning to lift as I walked through the narrow streets, past shops selling everything from jade jewelry to dried herbs. Inside, the center was bustling with activity. There were elderly men playing xiangqi in one corner, children practicing calligraphy at small tables, and the constant hum of conversations in multiple languages. The reception desk was managed by a young woman with short black hair and kind eyes. "I'm looking for David Chen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up from her paperwork. "David's in the archive room on the 3rd floor, but he's pretty busy today. Are you expected?" "It's about his uncle, Chen Liming." Her expression changed immediately. "I'll call him." She picked up the phone and spoke in rapid Cantonese. After a brief conversation, she hung up and pointed toward the stairs. "3rd floor, room 302. He's waiting for you." My heart was pounding as I climbed the narrow stairs. Each step felt like it brought me closer to answers I'd been seeking, but also closer to dangers I couldn't fully understand. Room 302 was a small office filled with filing cabinets and boxes of documents. Behind a cluttered desk sat a man in his 60s, with gray hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked up as I entered, and I could see the family resemblance immediately. He had the same thoughtful expression as his uncle in the old photographs. "You must be Sarah," he said, standing to shake my hand. "I've been wondering when someone from the Liu family would finally come looking for answers. You knew I would come. I hoped you would. Your grandfather and I corresponded occasionally over the years, always very carefully. He told me about you, said you were the one in the family who listened to his stories." David gestured for me to sit in the chair across from his desk. On the wall behind him were dozens of photographs, many of them showing the same people I'd seen in my grandfather's box. "My uncle Chen Liming died in 1987, David said quietly. "He was living in Vancouver under a false name. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but he was only 54 and had no history of heart problems." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Do you think they found him?" "I think they never stopped looking. The documents your great-grandfather discovered weren't just about corruption in Taiwan. They revealed a network of influence that extended to North America, involving people who had built new lives and careers on the foundation of stolen money and covered-up crimes." David opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. "Your grandfather sent me copies of some of the documents about 20 years ago. I've been researching the people mentioned in them ever since." He spread several photographs across his desk. Some faces were familiar from my grandfather's collection, but others were new. Then he showed me a more recent photo that made my blood freeze. It was Mrs. Patterson, but she looked about 30 years younger. She was standing next to a man in a suit, and they were both looking at some kind of document. The photo was dated 1985. "Helen Patterson," David said. "Real name, Helen Huang. She was recruited by the network in the early 1980s to monitor your grandfather. They knew he was getting closer to finding the documents, so they needed someone on the inside. She's been watching him for 40 years? Nearly. And she's not the only one. The network has been incredibly patient, placing people in key positions around anyone who might pose a threat. They've been waiting for the right moment to act." I thought about Jake and how he'd moved in just months after my grandfather's stories about surveillance had intensified. What about someone named Jake Morrison? He's a photographer, lives next to me in Portland. David typed something into his computer, then frowned. "Jake Morrison doesn't exist, at least not the one you know. The identity was created 18 months ago. Before that, there's no record of him anywhere." The room seemed to spin around me. "So he's been watching me?" "Most likely. The network has been very concerned about what might happen when your grandfather died. They knew he had been searching for the documents, and they suspected he might pass that information to someone in the family. But why now? Why after all these years?" David's expression grew grave. "Because the situation has changed. Some of the people implicated in the original documents have risen to positions of significant power. We're talking about business leaders, politicians, people who have built empires on the foundation of what they stole 60 years ago." He showed me a list of names. I recognized several of them. A tech billionaire, a state governor, a federal judge. People whose faces I'd seen on the news, who were celebrated as pillars of their communities. "If the original documents were made public now," David continued, "it wouldn't just expose historical crimes, it would bring down some of the most powerful people in the country. The network has become more desperate, more dangerous. What do they want? To retrieve all copies of the documents and eliminate anyone who knows about them. They've been systematically tracking down everyone connected to the original investigation. My uncle was just the first." I felt a wave of nausea. "Are you saying they killed my grandfather?" "I don't know for certain. But his death was very convenient for them. A quiet heart attack, no autopsy requested, and his house searched by helpful neighbors before the family could go through his belongings. Mrs. Patterson had been the one to find him. She'd been the one to call the paramedics, and she'd had hours alone in his house before my family arrived. "There's something else," David said, pulling out another folder. "Your grandfather wasn't the only one who inherited these documents. There were 3 copies made when your great-grandfather died. One went to your grandfather, one to my uncle, and one to a family in Los Angeles named Wong." What happened to the Wong family? They were killed in a car accident in 1992. The police said it was a brake failure, but the timing was suspicious. They'd been asking questions about their family history, trying to verify some of the stories they'd been told. My mouth felt dry. "So, I'm the last one?" "You're the last one who knows where the documents are, but there might be others who can help. The network isn't invincible. There are people who have been fighting them for years, waiting for the right moment to act." David reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a business card. "This is Dr. Margaret Thompson. She's the investigative journalist who's been tracking the network for the past 15 years. She's based in Seattle, which is close enough to provide support, but far enough from Portland to be safe. Can I trust her?" "She's the only person I trust completely. She's been targeted by the network herself, so she understands what you're going through." "But Sarah, you need to understand something. Once you make contact with her, there's no going back. The network will know you're actively working against them." I thought about my life in Portland, my job, my apartment, all the small comforts of normalcy I'd taken for granted. All of that felt like it belonged to someone else now. What happens if I don't fight them? If I just try to disappear? They'll find you eventually. And once they have the documents, they'll make sure you can never talk about what you've learned. The network has been playing a long game for 60 years. They're very good at making problems disappear permanently. I stared at the business card in my hand. Dr. Margaret Thompson. The name felt like a lifeline and a death sentence at the same time. "There's one more thing," David said. "Your grandfather left a message for you. He sent it to me 6 months ago, with instructions to give it to you if anything happened to him." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name, written in my grandfather's careful handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "My dear Sarah, if you are reading this, then you have found David and learned the truth about our family. I am sorry to burden you with this knowledge, but I could not let the truth die with me. The documents are hidden in a place that only you can find. Think about the stories I told you as a child, about the place where we first felt safe in America. The answer is there, waiting for you to discover it. But remember, the documents are not just evidence of crimes. They are proof that ordinary people can stand up to power and corruption, even when the cost is everything they hold dear. Your great-grandfather could have stayed silent and lived a comfortable life. Instead, he chose to fight for what was right. Now that choice is yours. I love you, and I believe in you. Your grandfather, Liu Wei-ming." I read the letter 3 times, trying to decode the clue about where the documents were hidden. The place where we first felt safe in America. Grandpa had told me many stories about their early years in Portland, but one location had always featured prominently in his tales. "I have to go back to Portland," I said. David nodded. "I thought you might, but Sarah, be very careful. They know you were here. They'll be watching every move you make from now on." As I left the cultural center, I felt like I was walking into a storm. The fog had lifted, and San Francisco sparkled in the afternoon sun, but I could feel the weight of invisible eyes following my every step. I had Dr. Thompson's card in my pocket, a grandfather's cryptic clue to solve, and the knowledge that going home meant walking into a trap. But I also had something I hadn't possessed when I'd first opened that box: purpose. The network had been hunting my family for 60 years. Now it was my turn to fight back. The flight back to Portland felt like a journey into enemy territory. I'd called Dr. Thompson from the San Francisco airport, and her voice had been both reassuring and urgent. "Sarah, I've been following your family's story for years. David Chen told me you might contact me. Where are you now?" "Airport. I'm flying back to Portland. That's extremely dangerous. They'll be watching every route back to the city. I have to go back. My grandfather left me a clue about where the real documents are hidden, and I think I know where to look." "Then you need backup. I'm driving down from Seattle tonight. Don't go anywhere alone, and don't trust anyone you haven't known for years." The problem was, I thought I'd known Jake for a year, and Mrs. Patterson for my entire life. My grandfather's warning echoed in my mind. Don't trust them. I landed in Portland at sunset, the autumn sky painting the city in shades of gold and crimson. The beauty of my hometown felt like a cruel joke now. How could something so familiar and peaceful be hiding such dark secrets? I took a taxi to a hotel downtown, paying cash and registering under a false name. From my window on the 7th floor, I could see the Willamette River winding through the city, and beyond it, the neighborhood where I'd grown up, where my grandfather had told me stories about the place where his family first felt safe, the Japanese garden. The memory hit me like a physical blow. Grandpa had taken me there dozens of times when I was a child, always telling me the same story about how he'd brought my grandmother there on their first week in Portland, how the carefully maintained beauty had reminded them of the gardens in Taiwan, and how they'd finally felt like they might be able to build a life in America. "This is where we knew we were home," he'd always say, standing by the stone lantern near the tea house. "This is where we felt safe for the first time." The stone lantern. It was the perfect hiding place, permanent enough to last decades, but innocuous enough that no one would think to look there. I was so absorbed in my revelation that I almost didn't notice the soft knock on my hotel room door. 3 short taps, then 2 longer ones. A pattern. "Sarah, it's Dr. Thompson." I looked through the peephole and saw a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and intelligent eyes. She was alone, and she looked exactly like the photo on her website. I opened the door, and she stepped inside quickly, scanning the room with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years looking over her shoulder. "We need to talk," she said, setting down a briefcase. "And then we need to move. I've been tracking network communications, and they know you're back in Portland." Dr. Thompson opened her briefcase and pulled out a tablet. The screen showed what looked like a surveillance interface, with dozens of small windows displaying different locations around the city. "They've mobilized everyone," she said. "Patterson is coordinating from her house, your neighbor Jake is positioned near your apartment, and they have at least 6 other operatives stationed around the city." "How do you know all this?" "I've been infiltrating their communications for 3 years. They think their network is secure, but they underestimated how determined a good investigative journalist can be." She showed me a series of text messages that had been sent in the past hour. "Subject has returned to Portland. Maintain surveillance at all known locations. Chen meeting confirmed. Assume she has full knowledge of documents. Authorization granted for permanent resolution if documents are retrieved." The last message made my blood run cold. Permanent resolution? They're done playing games, Sarah. Once they have the documents, they're going to eliminate everyone who knows about them. That includes you, me, and David Chen. I told her about my grandfather's clue and my theory about the Japanese garden. She nodded thoughtfully. "It makes sense. The garden has been there since the 1960s, and that stone lantern would be the perfect hiding place, but it's also exactly where they'd expect you to go. So what do? We use their expectations against them. I've been preparing for this moment for years. There's a way to expose the entire network, but it requires getting the documents and broadcasting the truth before they can stop us." Dr. Thompson pulled out a small device that looked like a modified cell phone. "This is connected to a network of independent journalists and activists around the world. The moment we authenticate the documents, they'll be simultaneously published on dozens of platforms. The network won't be able to suppress them all. But first we have to get them. And that means walking into their trap." We spent the next 2 hours planning our approach. Dr. Thompson had contacts in the city, people who'd been fighting the network from the shadows for years. By midnight, we had a plan that might work if we were very lucky and very careful. The Japanese garden was closed to the public, but Dr. Thompson's contact had provided us with a way in through the service entrance. We drove through the dark streets of Portland, taking a circuitous route to avoid the surveillance points she'd identified. The garden at night was a different world. The carefully maintained paths were silver ribbons in the moonlight, and the sound of running water created a peaceful soundtrack that seemed to mock the danger we were walking into. We found the stone lantern exactly where I remembered it, standing beside the tea house like a silent sentinel. Up close, I could see that the base was slightly different from the rest of the structure, newer concrete that had been designed to blend in but not quite match the original. "This is it," I whispered. Dr. Thompson kept watch while I examined the base of the lantern. After a few minutes, I found what I was looking for, a small section that moved slightly when pressed. It was a hidden compartment, so expertly concealed that it would have been invisible to casual observation. Inside was a waterproof container, and inside that were the documents that had cost my family so much. The originals in my great-grandfather's handwriting, along with photographs and financial records that would destroy some of the most powerful people in the country. But as I pulled the container from its hiding place, floodlights suddenly illuminated the entire garden. We were surrounded. "Dr. Sarah Chen," a voice called out through a megaphone. "Please step away from the lantern and place your hands where we can see them." I recognized the voice. It was Mrs. Patterson, but she sounded nothing like the sweet, elderly woman I'd known all my life. Her tone was cold, professional, authoritative. "You've led us on quite a chase, dear," she continued, "but it's time to end this game." Dr. Thompson grabbed my arm. "The documents. Do you have them?" "Yes." "Then we run. Now." What followed was the longest 10 minutes of my life. Dr. Thompson knew the garden better than I'd expected, leading us through narrow paths and hidden passages while the sound of pursuit echoed behind us. The documents were clutched against my chest, and I could feel the weight of 60 years of secrets in my hands. We reached the outer wall of the garden, where a rope ladder was waiting, another gift from Dr. Thompson's network of contacts. As we climbed, I could hear Mrs. Patterson's voice on a radio. "They're escaping through the north wall. Cut them off at the street." But Dr. Thompson's car was waiting, engine running, with a young man behind the wheel who looked like he'd been through this kind of thing before. "Go, go, go!" Dr. Thompson shouted as we jumped into the back seat. We drove through the dark streets of Portland, taking random turns and doubling back on ourselves. I was starting to think we'd escaped when the young man, Dr. Thompson had called him Marcus, looked in the rearview mirror and cursed. "They're following us. Black SUV, 2 cars back." "How many?" "At least 3 vehicles. They're coordinating." Dr. Thompson pulled out her modified phone. "Change of plans. We're going to broadcast from the car. Sarah, I need you to hold up the documents to the camera and start reading the most damning parts. We have maybe 10 minutes before they catch us." My hands were shaking as I held up the first document. It was a financial record showing payments from a Taiwanese government account to a private company in California. The amounts were staggering. Millions of dollars that had been stolen from the Taiwanese people and funneled into American businesses. "This document," I said, looking directly into the camera, "shows how a network of corrupt officials stole money from the Taiwanese government in the 1960s and used it to build business empires in America." I held up a photograph showing several men in suits, shaking hands over a table covered with documents. "These are the people responsible. Some of them are still alive today, still in positions of power." Dr. Thompson was typing frantically on her device. "It's uploading. 30 seconds to full distribution." That's when our car was rammed from behind. The impact sent us spinning, and I watched in horror as the documents scattered across the floor of the car. "Sarah!" Dr. Thompson shouted. "Keep reading. Whatever happens, keep reading." I grabbed the nearest document as our car came to a stop. Through the windshield, I could see Jake Morrison approaching with several other men. He was holding a gun, and he no longer looked like the friendly neighbor I'd thought I knew. "My grandfather, Liu Wei-ming, spent his entire life hiding from these people," I said into the camera, my voice stronger now, despite the fear. "My great-grandfather died trying to expose their crimes, but the truth doesn't die with the people who tell it." Jake was at the driver's side window now, tapping on the glass with his gun. "Turn off the camera, Sarah. This ends now." "No," I said, looking directly at him through the camera. "This is Jake Morrison, whose real name I don't even know. He's been watching me for over a year, pretending to be my friend while working for the people who killed my family." Dr. Thompson's phone beeped. "It's done. The documents are live on 47 different platforms. The whole world can see them now." Jake's expression changed from confident to desperate. He started shouting orders to the other men, but I could see in his eyes that he knew it was too late. The truth was out there now, beyond their ability to control or suppress. The next few hours were a blur of police sirens, FBI agents, and reporters. Dr. Thompson's network had done more than just publish the documents. They'd alerted every major news organization and law enforcement agency in the country. By dawn, the story was on the front page of every newspaper and the top of every news website. Mrs. Patterson, or Helen Huang as her real name turned out to be, was arrested at her house along with a cache of surveillance equipment and communications devices. Jake Morrison was taken into custody, and investigators began the process of unraveling a network that had operated in the shadows for 60 years. But the most satisfying moment came 3 days later when I received a phone call from David Chen. "Sarah, have you seen the news?" I was in a hotel room in Seattle under FBI protection while the investigation continued. "Which news?" "The governor of California just resigned. The federal judge in Oregon has been suspended pending investigation. And that tech billionaire whose name was on the documents? His company's stock has crashed, and the SEC is launching a full investigation." I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I'd been carrying without even realizing it. Is it over? The network is finished. There are still individual cases to prosecute, but the organization that killed my uncle and hunted your family for 60 years is gone. That evening, I sat in my hotel room and wrote a letter to my grandfather. I knew he'd never read it, but I needed to tell him that his mission was complete. "Dear Grandpa, I found the documents, I found the truth, and I made sure the whole world knows what happened to our family and why. You were right not to trust them, but you were also right to trust me. The burden you carried for so long is finally lifted. The people who killed your father and hunted our family are facing justice. The network that operated in darkness for 60 years has been exposed to the light. I understand now why you told me those stories when I was a child. You were preparing me for this moment, teaching me to listen, to question, to never accept easy answers. The box you left me didn't just contain documents, it contained the truth about who we are and what we're capable of when we choose to fight for what's right. Thank you for trusting me with this responsibility. Thank you for believing I was strong enough to finish what your father started. I love you, and I'm proud to be your granddaughter. Sarah." 6 months later, I was back in Portland, but everything had changed. My apartment building had new tenants. Jake's unit was now occupied by a retired teacher who actually was what she seemed to be. Mrs. Patterson's house had been sold to a young family with 2 small children who filled the neighborhood with the sound of laughter. I kept my grandfather's house, turning his study into a small memorial to everyone who had fought against the network. The box that had started it all sat on his desk, but now it was filled with letters from people around the world who had been inspired by the story to investigate their own family histories and uncover their own truths. Dr. Thompson had become a close friend, and together we'd established a foundation to help other families who had been targeted by corruption and conspiracy. We called it the Chen Li-Ming Foundation, after the man who had first warned us about the network's reach. But the most important change was in myself. I was no longer the passive observer of my grandfather's stories. I had become an active participant in the ongoing fight for truth and justice. The network was gone, but there would always be other networks, other conspiracies, other people who believed they could operate in the shadows without consequences. And there would always be people like me, ordinary individuals who refused to accept lies and chose to fight for the truth, no matter the cost. Standing in my grandfather's garden on the anniversary of his death, I realized that the box he'd left me hadn't just contained documents, it had contained a choice. I could have ignored the warning, burned the papers, and tried to live a normal life, or I could have chosen to carry on his fight. I'd made my choice, and in doing so, I discovered that the most powerful weapon against corruption isn't money or influence or political connections. It's the willingness of ordinary people to stand up and tell the truth, even when that truth is dangerous. The rain had stopped, and for the first time in months, Portland was bathed in golden sunlight. I looked up at the sky and smiled, knowing that somewhere my grandfather was finally at peace. The truth had set us all free.